Good evening. We'll be starting in a couple of minutes. Just give people a bit of time to get themselves logged in and so on, and then we'll kick off. Numbers of people who are viewing is creeping up, so bear with me just till we've got everybody who wants to be taking part in this. And Ines has just said hello, so hi Aidan, so hi Ines. We're up to 20 so far. Oh, hi Tina. We're into the 30s. Yes, Susan's just commented what magnificent library. Yes, it's only recently installed. We moved house a few weeks ago, and finally, after 30 odd years, I've got a room I can actually line with bookcases. So that's what we are at the moment. So greetings back to everybody who is typing their greetings at the moment. From Mexico, Romania, Canada, Egypt, of course, Denmark. Yes, we've got quite an eclectic bunch already on board. Oh, and then Netherlands as well. So we're up to 50 at the moment. So once the number has stabilised, I'll get going. And Brazil. And we're on 60. Right, we've got to 61 and don't appear to be going up rapidly after that. So let's kick off. It's normally the best way of getting maximum number of people aboard is once you've actually kicked off and started. Okay, first of all, to introduce myself, I'm Aidan Dodson. I'm currently Honorary Full Professor of Egyptology at the University of Bristol in the UK, where I've been teaching since 1996. Also during the last few years, in the spring of 2013, I was Simpson Professor of Egyptology at the American University in Cairo, which is a one semester thing where the university brings out foreign scholars for a semester to teach and so on, which was a really great experience. But I've also been involved with AUC in some way for a long time. A close friend of mine is Salim Rikram, who's the Professor of Egyptology now at AUC. And I've also published with AUC Press for quite some time. First of all, sort of rather indirectly, when some books which I originally published with the Anglo-American publisher Thames and Hudson were co-published, so Complete Royal Families came out in an AUC Press edition, and Tomb in Ancient Egypt, which written with Salima, is another one of that. So certainly I've had some kind of involvement with the press for a while. Then a few years ago, probably about just over 10 years ago, I started shifting to writing a series of what I might call synthetic kind of books on history. My interest has been in the history of ancient Egypt, often through the prism of material culture for a long time. My PhD was on canopic equipment to the kings of Egypt. So what did their tombs say about it? So a lot of that that's where I've come from over the years with these things. But also, like a lot of scholars during their earlier years of their careers, writing lots and lots of articles on little bits of history, little bits particularly of certain periods of history, which I take a very interested in, the Amarna period and so on. Then, so about 10 years ago, I decided to start trying to produce some more synthetic kinds of works. I actually put, rather than just sort of exposing my views on one little bit of history, to try and sort of tie it all together into a bigger story. And that really kicked off as far as the press was concerned when I wrote this book, Amarna Sunset, on the latter years of the 18th dynasty. This actually is the second edition, which came out a couple of years ago. One thing which shows how Egyptology works is the fact that in the less than 10 years between the first edition and this paperback edition, I had to rewrite 75% of the pages. Literally, history does change almost overnight where Egyptology is concerned. Discovering one new inscription can have a knock-on effect, because one has to bear in mind that when you're writing the history of ancient Egypt, or actually most of the ancient world for that matter, at least prior to Hellenistic times, whatever you're coming up with is really a working hypothesis. It's not really history in the way that it is when you're writing things more close in time. Now, interpretations can change massively even with modern history as to why people did things, archival things. But as far as ancient history is concerned, and the real ancient history like Egypt, Mesopotamia and so on, you can actually have things changing absolutely fundamentally. Whether people existed or not, what gender they were, whether what we thought was one person is actually two people, even three people. And those are the sorts of things that can have these really massive knock-on effects on things. So therefore, actually, the other books I wrote at that phase from about 2009 onwards, and again with the press, the sort of prequel to Amarna Sunset, and another one on the Third Intermediate period after Gulf Empire, these are all the new editions. A massive amount of change happened just simply in the period between me first writing it and then a reprint being due and thinking, hey, what needs to be changed? And the answer was often a huge amount had to be changed. Now, those are sort of middlebrow books, I call them. They're certainly intended to be scholarly, but also accessible to the interested public. But they have black and white pictures, whereas a couple of years ago, it was agreed with the press that I'd start a series of books which actually are rather more colourful. They came about slightly through accident in the sense that the MD of the press was down at the wonderful Aboudis bookshop in Luxor, one of the finest bookshops for Egyptology anywhere, and was talking to the later generation of Aboudis to run the place, and was asked, what book are you often asked for which doesn't exist? And the answer was a book on Seti I and his tomb. that was sort of said to me, well, that sounds like quite an interesting idea. And therefore, that is how this book was produced. Seti I, King of Egypt, His Life and Afterlife. Initially going to be a one-off. And basically the approach was to produce something which was an attractive full colour book. So rather than, so therefore we have nice colour pictures and so on. It's carrying on the sort of middle brow approach in the sense that it's fully scholarly, in the sense that we have a full set of end notes to explain sort of how everything, where all the information comes from, full bibliography and so on. But also written in a way that is accessible to not only the Egyptophile, but also somebody who is just trying to get into it as well. So it's as an author, that's quite an interesting sort of tightrope to try and walk, to try and write something which is accessible to somebody who's not really initiated into the world of Egyptology, but also is sound enough to also be usable by colleagues, by students, and so on. And that's really where, say, this came about. And the idea of Life and Afterlife was interesting. There was nothing on his life, but also his gorgeous tomb recently been reopened to the public, and therefore that was how that came together. But also in putting together that combination of what was sort of that original sort of mission statement from Abudi's, which was the king and his tomb, it was to think about what can you do with that? Is it just simply you do a chunk of history and then a bit about then the tomb? How then that sort of expanded more to what does afterlife really mean? Afterlife, there is an afterlife in the sense of what Seti, in the sense of this first book, believed would happen to him in the next world. So what are the Egyptian beliefs around that? What's the tomb's function as a magical machine, as we sometimes call it, in trying to, in moving the dead king from this world to the next. But also there's another afterlife which any ancient Egyptian has, which is the afterlife he or she has gained in modern times, particularly during the period from the beginning of the 19th century, when we first started to realise these people existed again. Because it's important to recognise that there was that from the end of paganism, actually even before the end of paganism, so the early years AD, through until the point where Champollion first managed to start being able to read hieroglyphs again, that whole swathe of time, nearly 1,500 years, when nobody could read this stuff, these people then suddenly reappear on stage. A few of them had been sort of vaguely visible, looking at the some of the classical authors, Manetho, Herodotus, and so on. But really, they were being seen through a very distorted lens there. Then in the 1820s, we start seeing them again. And then there's a whole fascinating story of how they appear out of the gloom into something which is recognizable, recognizing that some of the ancient Egyptian names are the same as some of those from the classical authors, and then trying to work out a life story from them. And that is often very, very difficult because, as I've said in an article in the book, which may happen one day, is very much we're looking at ancient Egypt through a mirror, but that mirror has been shattered into innumerable fragments. Many of the pieces are missing. So we're looking at events, glimpsing little things of events or possible events, which over the years, more bits of that mirror, to stretch the metaphor a little bit, have been found, and we're able to start working out how those bits relate to each other. But it does mean that as I was sort of implying a bit earlier on, that writing any kind of Egyptian history is effectively a working hypothesis, and that hypothesis is very much a work in progress. So when you look at what we think about even quite a well-known figure of ancient Egyptian history, as to what Champollion, Wilkinson, and some of those other very early scholars thought they knew about these people, and then what we know now is sometimes that picture is completely different. And it's often it's only because of one little thing has been found subsequently, or just sometimes an assumption which was made by Champollion or Wilkinson or one of these other real pioneers of Egyptology was wrong, and we just followed them because that seemed a good idea. What they'd come up with seemed a perfectly good idea. Well, then that moves on, and that's been one of the cases. One of the reasons why this thing got heavily rewritten was because suddenly we realised that two kings who'd been put a certain way round by Champollion back in the 1820s for perfectly reasonable reasons, they weren't. They were the other way around, and the ripples moving on from that are the case. And it's not quite so much the case with SETI, so the first of the Life and Afterlife series, but certain things as the topic which we're sort of really talking about tonight, my book on Rameses III, there have been a number of points during the last 150 or so years where our view of Rameses has changed somewhat. As I say, this format for the book, which has become the Life and Afterlife series, was really set almost accidentally by the writing of SETI, but having written it, it struck me that this actually was a way of doing it. So therefore, what we're looking at is a king, what we know about his life, then his monuments. Then the afterlife means one can have a look at the tomb, particularly if he's got a particularly nice one, and then look at the modern historiography about how this person is rediscovered, how his monuments are rediscovered, and how they're all put together. Because one of the things I have found during my sort of career is I'm as fascinated by what we do with these people in modern times as I am really what they got up to in ancient times. And I've been recently involved in the editing of a massive history of Egyptology, which explains somehow why some of these things move on. So let's sort of go and talk a bit about Rameses and the book itself. Now, why write a book on Rameses III? Why this particular pharaoh at this particular point in time? Well, first of all, there isn't very much about him as a standalone book. There are books around which cover his reign, and there is a book about him, but it's actually a multi-author, quite heavy thing written some years ago. And although it's quite useful for the scholar, extremely useful for the scholar for that matter, for somebody who just really wants to get a basic download on what we know, what we think we know about Rameses III, that doesn't really exist. So therefore, that seems to be good. Also, from the point of view of the fact that these books are intended to be sort of nice colour things rather than the black and white, which is sort of normal fare for Egyptian history. Really wanted people who'd actually got some quite nice stuff. Whereas Rameses certainly is one of those. He has got a gorgeous tomb. He's got a magnificent temple to Medinet Habu. The story of some of the rediscovery of some of this is a good one. So therefore, that's another reason why Rameses III, he deserved something, but also he was able. It was somebody who would actually fit in quite nicely with this, with the approach of this. He's also an important figure in Egyptian history. He's often been called the last great pharaoh. Whether that is true or not depends on a number of things. How do you define great, for example? And also how you think about Egyptian history, because for a lot of people, Egyptian history rather fizzles out around 1200 BC, even though there's another over 1,000 years to go. The third intermediate period, the late period, Ptolemaic period in Rome. Often people don't really take. So he's certainly the last sort of major pharaoh of that classic period down to about 1200, the end of the Egyptian New Kingdom. On the other hand, there are kings who I think one can regard as great kings after that, particularly Shoshenq I, who very much sort of reboots Egypt after a long period of a long period of economic and political collapse. He resumes building work at Karnak. He actually carries out the first few military campaigns into Syria, Palestine, first for many, many years. So he probably counts as a great pharaoh. And then further on, later on, Psamtik I, the founder of the 26th dynasty, basically allows Egypt to recover from the humiliation of the Assyrian invasion and re-establishes Egypt as a major power for at least its last gasp, if you like, during the 26th dynasty, before the Persians come in and it all becomes rather horrible after that. But so whether he's the last great pharaoh, he is the last great pharaoh, I think, of his era, if depending on how one defines great. And that's one of the issues with Ramesses as well, is that when you look at his life, it seems to divide into sort of two phases. One where he is certainly ticking all the great boxes, but then the latter end where clearly he's things are falling apart, whether it's due to him or simply he's a victim of circumstance. I don't know. So going back to the very sort of the great side of Ramesses. Well, he comes at a point in Egyptian history at a low point. During the previous couple of decades, Egypt had been torn apart by civil war. The long reign of Rameses II had been followed by the decade of Meremptar's reign, during which time he'd had to fight off a Libyan-led invasion, but still seemed to have sort of kept it together. But then after his death, then there is, within a couple of years of Meremptar's death, there's a usurping pharaoh in the south of Egypt, Amenmeses. There is a period of civil war between him and the legitimate king Seti. Then we get a king of uncertain origin, Siptah, who seems to be the puppet of a man called Bai, who was the chancellor of Egypt, possibly of Syrian extraction, who actually claims explicitly to be a kingmaker. Now, he's the one who put the king on the throne. It's not the gods, it's him, it's Bai. And then he is ruling Egypt for this young king Siptah, alongside the widow of the last pharaoh, legitimate pharaoh, Seti II. They seem to be working as a team, and then all of a sudden, Bai is executed. A year later, Siptah is dead, and Taosret, the widow of Seti II, is female pharaoh, but assuming that the regnal years of Siptah. So it's all rather, things are not going well. Then a man of uncertain origin, but probably a scion of the family of Rameses II, given he'd left 100 children, named called Setnachti, revolts against Taosret, and 2 years later is sole pharaoh. 2 years on, he's dead, and his son, Rameses III, is king of Egypt. So Setnachti clearly must have tried to put the country back together, but it's the 3 decades of the reign of Rameses III which clearly must have been important in trying to get Egypt back something like on keel after this period at the end of the 19th dynasty, which actually is covered by another of my AUC Press books called Poisoned Legacy. So he becomes king. He kicks off as any sort of great king does, a building program, and during his reign he builds, restores, or re-endows temples the whole length of Egypt, a number of which are identifiable today archaeologically, but others are long since swept away. So all we've got are the records of Rameses III's work, of which they were showing that they once existed. Ones which do it, we can identify are his great temple complex at Medinet Harbour on the West Bank at Thebes. There's also a small temple at the entrance to Karnak Temple, which is his. Khonsu Temple at Karnak was his. Also, there's a temple in the Mut precinct at Karnak, which was his. So there's a pretty, so there's certainly plenty of evidence for the work he did. But then he gets involved in military campaigns, which are recorded on the walls of the Medinet Habu temple, and also some episodes are also to be found in some of these other temples. Again, all sorts of it. This is all to do with questions of preservation and stuff, of course. And of those military campaigns, the most crucial was that against the so-called Sea Peoples. Now, the accession of Rameses III coincides with what we call the Late Bronze Age collapse. For the period up to about 1200 BC, the Near East, Middle East, so the area, Egypt, through into Libya, through into Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, all of that seems to have gone through something of a golden age, where pretty well the whole region was prosperous, where the whole region was relatively at peace. Okay, there were certainly border wars between the various great powers, there were rebellions, there were all sorts of things. But by the standards of the ancient Near East, and sadly to some degree the modern Near East, it was a fairly peaceful period of time. Kings writing to each other, marrying each other's daughters, all that kind of thing. Then, however, around 1200 BC, it all starts to go wrong. And it all seems to start going wrong in the north. Somewhere in the region, probably the Balkans, that sort of area, possibly Italy, that kind of area, something happens. We don't know quite what, whether it was some kind of natural disaster, a plague, we just don't know for certain. But what it does seem to be is the first domino of a series of events, which then leads to a series that people start moving. Refugees, revolutionaries, again, we can't be quite clear. But what does happen is we can see that there is this wave of people move from the Balkans, possibly the Adriatic, that kind of area, through Greece, and the great Bronze Age civilizations of Greece, the Mycenaean civilization, appears to be knocked out. We find destruction levels or abandonment levels of places which have been occupied for generations. And this great sea of people move around down into the Aegean. Under Muremptar, some of them appear to have split off and gone and joined Libyans in trying to attack Egypt. But the main thrust is to the south, the southeast, through Anatolia, modern Turkey, into modern Lebanon, Syria, and so on through there. And when you look at both what Rameses says in his texts about what's going on and look at the archaeological evidence on the ground, it seems pretty clear that it's this great movement. Rameses calls them the Sea Peoples, and they've often been wrongly thought to be wrongly thought to be a single group. They're not. They're basically a coalition of opportunity, perhaps, the best way of looking at them. Anyway, they move around, knock out various places, and finally they get stopped in both a land battle and a sea battle by Rameses III. And that appears to be the end of that, although the damage done to the international economy seems to be long-lasting. Much of the ancient world moves into a dark age, and Egypt itself, within a couple of generations, is suffering probably from such a severe economic downturn that even people have to be coffins get reused from generation to generation. So the thing, it's not the end, but at least he sort of stops the immediate rot. And he also then probably carries out further military activity up into Syria and so on, which to try and sort of stabilize things. So the first half of the reign, solid military success, lots of building work, all of which seems to be marking him out as a great pharaoh. And then we find as he moves towards the latter part of his reign in the late 20s, we're finding economic problems. We're finding that even the favoured tomb workmen, the people who are based at Deir el-Medina on the West Bank at Luxor, are go on strike. They do the first strike, the first sit-down protest in recorded sit-down in history, because they're not getting paid. The community is run by the state, and therefore they get paid in grain for their work, both to eat, but also in the barter economy, which was current in ancient Egypt, that they would then exchange surpluses for luxuries and so on. They don't get that, and therefore they protest heavily. They go on strike. They do a sit down. They get some of their back rations, but then it's quite clear that the shortfall then is carried on. And one thing that's quite interesting is that all this is happening in year 29. Year 30 is the Jubilee year. A king normally has a major party, building all sorts of things in year 30, but we have virtually no evidence for that. We know that a Jubilee was celebrated, but only by some very, very minor bits of detail, not the kind of Jubilee monuments we find under Rameses II or Amenhotep III and people like that. So clearly the country is in trouble. And then, 2 years later, the king is assassinated. We know about the assassination from 2 points of view. One is actually the body of the king himself. And although for a long time it was stated in books there was no sign of wounds, well, simply no, he had looked properly. He was CAT scanned a few years ago, and it was found his throat had been cut all the way back to his spine. So I think that death by assassination is fairly obvious. Also, rather bizarrely, one of his toes got cut off in the same assault. Not quite sure how that happened. But anyway, we know he's killed violently. And secondly, which we've known about since the 19th century, is there is a whole dossier of documents available which explain, which narrate the story of the trial and condemnation of those. And it seems to have been run by one of his wives who wanted her son to become king rather than Rameses IV, who seems to have been the legitimate heir. But the very fact that there could be a major conspiracy, and when you read it, it's not just simply we want a different person king. It's clear they're stirring up major disturbances and so on. So therefore, the end of the reign, although a king being assassinated doesn't necessarily sort of count against them in the great stakes, there are plenty of kings who've ended up rather unfortunately. The very fact that when you combine it with this other information about economic problems and so on, it all does rather suggest that something went horribly wrong. Whether it was Ramesses' own fault, whether it was, we can never tell these things at this kind of stage. So therefore, as far as what happened to the conspirators, well, there was 2 options. Some of them were executed, but some of the more high status ones, for example, the prince who had been due to be the new pharaoh, they were allowed to commit suicide. Very similar kind of thing you also find in sort of Roman world, where the lesser players are executed, but the more senior people are allowed to take their own lives. So that's the question about that. And also what's interesting there is this whole question about great or not is in more modern times there have been debates over whether or not all these depictions of wars on Medinet Habu, and also they're actually mentioned in a sort of a memorial volume which Rameses IV commissions for his father, which lists all his military activities, his civil activities, and also is the source for all this information about all the temples he built. Been question marks about how real that is. And there was a trend in the 1980s really to do Rameses down and claim that almost all his battle reliefs and records in this papyrus, the Great Harris Papyrus down at the British Museum, were simply empty claims, or empty puff, effectively. And they're claiming that all these reliefs were actually being copied from Rameses II or Muremptar. although this argument was slightly undermined by saying they were copied from reliefs of Merintah which no longer exist, which is a bit problematic. And then but then people started looking more closely and started realizing that there is not a single one of Ramesses' reliefs which are demonstrably copies. When he mentions some of the places he's been, well, nobody's mentioned these places ever before. So it's been a case of looking, actually realizing that actually most of this stuff probably is real. And it's another little sort of thing which is worthwhile noting in Egyptology. There's often a grave danger of sort of just jumping to conclusions on the basis of superficial reading of the data. It was only when people started reading these texts in detail and then cross-referencing them with others that it became real that they are unique, and therefore suggest that old Ramesses probably wasn't was telling the truth rather than sort of making it all up. Although again, we have to be quite careful because we know that there were certain things which an Egyptian king was supposed to do, smiting enemies and all that kind of thing. And there are certainly cases where you find these kind of scenes of people probably who never did any of this. But when you start looking at things you've got, it's very difficult to tell lies when you've got to go into detail. When you've got detail can be tested, and then that's much more likely to be real. So that's the first part of it, and then we go on. There's a whole section in the book on his tomb, for example. So his beautifully decorated tomb in the Valley of the Kings. So sort of scenes like that, and then I sort of go on and talk about what happened to his mummy. It was removed from his tomb not long after his death, actually, and then ultimately was found hidden with a whole load of other royal mummies near Deir el-Bahri in the 19th century. Curiously enough, his coffin went into a completely different tomb and ended up with a different pharaoh in it, all indicating how sort of confused we were. And then, so the book then goes on to talk about the 19th century, not so much rediscovery of his tomb. Now we've got there appears to be a problem with my video at the moment, so hopefully you can still hear me. But the video transmission seems to have gone horribly wrong. We'll see what happens. So hopefully you can still hear me talk anyway, even if the video has gone a little bit awry. So what was I saying? Yeah, luckily about this the 19th century examination of the tomb, because it got damaged by water. There was water managed to get in during the middle of the 19th century, and chambers which had been copied quite beautifully at the beginning part of the 19th century are now very, very badly damaged. Although a German expedition is now trying to sort of pick up the pieces, almost literally. As for what
we can hear you and see you.
Oh, you can. Oh, okay. My wife tells me you can actually see me, but for some reason the screen which is showing what I'm doing isn't showing at the moment. So anyway, let me just finish off before I then go to questions which I note are coming in. Is what else am I sort of doing next? Well, having sort of kicked off this series, it's carrying on. The next one is going to be a little bit different in the sense it's not just simply one pharaoh, but a whole bunch of them. The first pharaohs, the kings of the first three dynasties. Clearly not enough known about them individually, but collectively one can do some quite interesting stuff about them. So that's the next one. Next one in progress, though actually in the press already being printed is one on Nefertiti. In her case, it's Queen and Pharaoh of Egypt, but that should be out in the autumn, inshallah. And then following on from that, there is going to be one on Tutankhamun as a shameless cash-in with the centenary of the discovery of the tomb. So hopefully autumn 2022 there will be that. And then following on from that, I've also got contract signed to write ones on the Nubian pharaohs, and also on Thutmose III and Hatshepsut, which should all keep me busy for the next few years, inshallah. Copies of books are available in the UK via Bloomsbury Books, who are the distributors. Hang on. Now, Suzanne's saying I should scroll up and see myself. No, I've simply got a black screen saying, sorry, we're having trouble with playing this video as far as mine's concerned. But if everybody else can see me, that's fine. Bookshop.com or Amazon in the US, also Amazon in the UK as well and elsewhere. Most major bookshops can order it, and AUC bookstores, of course, in Egypt, and of course Aboudi, who kicked off the whole process. So anyway, so I can't see myself. That's probably not a bad thing. You can still see and hear me. So let me have a little quick look at some of sort of questions which have come up on the side here. Let's have a little look. First little question. I'm just doing this purely in the order they are which have come up on my screen. Do you find any validity with the claims of Omseti, Dorothy Eady as to life in ancient Egypt? Well, I clearly Omseti, who was clearly genuine about what she thought, and also was quite a good Egyptologist. I honestly don't believe in sort of the occult and sort of this kind of thing. So much as what he actually said, what she says, how far that is what she sort of gained from her sort of spiritual stuff, and how much because she was a good Egyptologist, I don't know. Next one down, was Rameses unlucky to be king when outside forces started the decline of Egypt? He probably was. I think any king at that period, given what was going on in the broader world at that time, would have had issues. Whether or not he did well or not, as compared with any other, very difficult to tell. That's a problem. There's the old Chinese curse: "May you live in interesting times." And and if that and I think anybody who was living in the years from 1200 onwards was going to be in a difficult position. At least he sort of got through that, which may not have been the case with his Mycenaean, Ugaritic, and sort of other contemporaries. Let me carry on down here. Patke, did the documents of the trial make it clear that Rameses III had died in the attack? No, they don't. And what's interesting about those documents is they state that the tribunal was set up by Rameses himself. What I suspect is going on here is that that Rameses IV just takes the view that that whoever actually set it up, it should have been set up by Rameses. Also, there's some little interesting stuff about exactly when a king's reign began. There are some indications that a king is still in office until he's buried, and that might also be part of it. But it's always been a little bit of an issue, and that was one of the arguments for a long time. Well, no, he possibly wasn't actually killed. But when you see what's happened, you see his cut throat, it becomes pretty clear that he must have. He couldn't have survived any time to sort of get the tribunal set up. One session in the past had been that he'd been more badly wounded, but had managed to sort of croak out the orders to set up the trials before expiring. That's not possible when your head has nearly been cut off. So let's carry on down. What else have we got? Can you talk more about the strike at Deir el-Medina? Well, fundamentally what happened for this is that there was been a series of failures to deliver the I'm just actually just flipping through the book just to remind myself of where we are on that. But basically, there's a series of failures to deliver the deliver the food, and then what happens is that's clearly something. There's one's a final straw. Because actually we know that even earlier in the 20s of the reign, even before year 29, when everything sort of kicks off, the mid-20s, there's a letter to the vizier reporting that while works proceeding satisfactorily, the community, this is Deir el-Medina we're talking about, was utterly impoverished, with storehouses empty, and a delivery of grain reclaimed and then swapped for a substandard batch. But so the key point is 2 Akhet 21 in year 29, when the scribe of the tomb Amenachti denounced the fact that the grain ration was 20 days late and secured a temporary issue of 46 sacks from the memorial temple of Horemheb. Interestingly, that issue of an interim issue coincides with the vizier To becoming vizier of the whole of Egypt. Previously only been the vizier of Upper Egypt. Here now he's becoming vizier of the whole of Egypt. But then shortfalls to live, and a few months later, on 2 Peret 10 of year 29, when month's rations were 18 days overdue, and also the previous month hadn't been delivered at all, the whole of the Deir el-Medina crew left the village and gathered at the back of the memorial temple of Thutmose III. There, they were found by Amenachti, who's the scribe of the tomb. He's the head of the admin side of Deir el-Medina, and other members of the community. The following day, they moved to the southern gate of the Ramesseum, where the scribe of one of the scribes responsible for part of the team obtained some cakes for them. Then, having spent the night there, they went into the Ramesseum itself, and there, at that time, the chief of police, Monchimose, left to confer with the mayor, and after appealing to senior members of the staff, the outstanding rations for that month, for the previous month, were delivered. And at that point, the workmen returned to Deir el-Medina, and further, and soon afterwards, the missing that month's were issued. But clearly that wasn't the end. We've now find more examples of this kind of thing happening. There's local corruption, half issues of grain are brought out the next. So it all carries on. But basically, it is like a lot of stuff when we're looking at the history of ancient Egypt. This is a snapshot of what's going on. Of what's going on. Clearly, we have got this one papyrus which gives all the accounts of this. We've got a few ostraca which give a little bit of more evidence. But so we're having to pick together the whole thing and say but the progress seems to be downward from the mid-20s onwards, and then culminates in the assassination of the king. Not that long afterwards.
You asked a question about sources.
Did I? Sorry.
Yeah.
So my wife's just telling me I missed a question.
Jim, someone wrote something. Could you?
Sorry, I'm trying to. I obviously missed it somewhere, but no, I can't find it. Find what she's talking about. I'm afraid. Okay, just bear in mind, my assistant will read out the one I've missed, obviously. Let me carry on about a question about do I think that the present COVID-19 situation presents an opportunity for sites of archaeological interest to be looted or damaged? I honestly don't know. I've not been. I would hope not. It's not quite the same situation as happened in the 2011 revolution, where police went missing and so on. So hopefully not. I wouldn't have thought that would be the case. What's this question which
it was
I've missed?
A question about Could you explain?
Oh, sorry. Could you discuss some of your sources, especially any original sources? Well, I've really been talking about them up to now. Reed. The key sources are the Great Harris Papyrus, the sort of memorial papyrus produced by Rameses IV for his father. There's the decoration of the various temples. Oh, but also I think for any kind of history of this period, the documents from Deir el-Medina are crucial, because these are sort of real time. These are very much real time kind of documents, which allow you to see what's going on. But it's a lot of it is those are the key things. But there are, of course, sort of other there are other things. The moving on, next one just come in about this question about the trials. Is it possible that there was a first assassination attempt which failed, so Rameses III could set up the perpetrators, and then he was sometime later finally fatally attacked? Not impossible. But the trouble is here we've got absolutely nothing to go on. We're having to. All this is actually we're sort of quite honestly making it up as we go along. So that is perfectly possible. However, the tone of the whole thing is that the king is being killed. It's not simply an investigation into a conspiracy. It does seem that. So I think that the most economical assumption is he was indeed killed, and that the attribution of the retribution, if you like, to Rameses III himself, where may have been propagandistic, or say it's possible when you look at sort of some of the things to do with the sealing of Tutankhamun's tomb, there does appear to be a case to be made for the king's formal reign, actually not his authority not actually handed over to a new king until the funeral has been taken place. Just had a question about the history of the Great Harris Papyrus. Well, basically, the papyrus was found in the middle of the 19th century by somewhere near Deir el-Medina, Medinet Habu, somewhere in that kind of area, by local villagers. Possibly in a pot, possibly in a tomb. The story does sort of vary between, but in any case, it went into the collection of Anthony Harris, who was a merchant, British merchant, who lived in Alexandria and made a major collection. In fact, a lot of the major papyri for the history of the Ramesside period passed through his hands, including a lot of those which are dealing with the tomb robberies at the end of the 20th dynasty. Those passed to his daughter Salima, who then sold collection mainly to the British Museum. So that's the basic route is from Medinet Habu to Alexandria in the Harris collection, and then on to the British Museum, where the papyri have been ever since. Question there: if you could, what would you like to be able to ask Rameses III? I think my big one was, what's the problem with you and your family? Because something I didn't mention, which is something which, again, probably may well have fed into his assassination, is that at Medinet Habu, he never actually fills in the names of any of the members of his family. There's a picture of his queen, complete with titles, in one of the reliefs. Her cartouche is blank. There are walls with princes all queuing up to pay tribute to their father, but none of the names have ever been filled in. The only names that have been filled in were done after his death. So is this all to do with a problem about which wife is senior and therefore should be the one who appears in the this relief, and possibly a knock-on effect because he had at least 3 great wives as far as we can see. What connected with that is, what's the seniority of their children? Does the seniority depend on their order of birth? Does it depend on the seniority of their mothers? So there's lots of little stuff around that. So I think that's what I'd say is, look, what is it with you, your wives, and your sons? What's wrong? What's wrong? I think because that would really, I think, elucidate an awful lot about what happens subsequently going on. There is a question about if the legendary founder of Scotland, Scota, was a daughter of Akhenaten. A book was written on this some years ago, which was utter junk. Like a lot of these legendary things, there's the feeling of Egypt as being a place where things come from comes up in a lot of sort of establishment myths around the world, and I think this is one of those. So the question is, did Scota, the daughter of Akhenaten, immigrate to Scotland? No, I think is the answer to that one. One other question, a follow-up to the what question would you like to ask Rameses III? Vanessa has asked, I would ask him who cut his throat, but I'm not sure he'd be able to answer that given his throat's cut. So anyway, I think I've picked up all the questions which have been asked. Hopefully you can all still see and hear me. So as far as my screen is telling me that you can't, but clearly you can because you're reacting with me. So thank you very much indeed for joining me this evening. Hopefully that has given you some insight into sort of why I write, how I write, what was the intention of these of the book, and say Rameses, available now, as is Seti. Nefertiti should be available in October, inshallah, and all other things being equal, part of it is to do with the problems with the COVID. I can't get to the main academic libraries, so finishing off the first pharaohs might not be as easy as it might, but it should all be doable. So then the basic idea is there should be one of this series, the Life and Afterlife series, coming out each autumn. That is the plan. So hopefully you will, hopefully you those of you who read this stuff enjoy it. Those who haven't read it, hopefully you will do. I want to say this: what's the next book about? Well, the next book from this series is Nefertiti, with what next one being written is to do with the first pharaohs. But actually, I also write books on naval history. So in the middle of all that, there's going to be a book on German cruisers of the Imperial German Navy. But I suspect that the audience for this probably aren't necessarily as you're all as necessarily as susceptible to that as other ones might be. So anyway, right. Anyway, so thank you very much indeed for your attention, and perhaps a year or two, perhaps when Nefertiti's out, the press might like me to talk to you again. But anyway, good night, and thank you all very much. Masalama.